Good morning, kids. Today we are finishing Attack of the Volcano Monkeys, and we will be reading chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is called Taking It Away. McGugan led Basil and Louise back down to the lagoon. As they came closer to the water, Basil looked up and scanned the sky. "What happened to the owls?" he asked, still jumpy. They undoubtedly flew back to Helios, where they were born. Von Rottweil and Vex controlled them with a whistling device that can only be heard by the owls. Once they lost control of the island, they lost control of the owls. As they neared the submarine, the professor stopped abruptly. A shiny metal object had popped up to the surface of the water. It was covered with prongs. Another one popped up, and another. "Hurry!" The professor scooped up Basil and Louise and staggered away from the water. But before he could say another word, the lagoon erupted with a thunderous explosion. Shockwaves sent all three flying. What's going on? The professor took the brunt of it as he shielded the children with his body. Basil and Louise sat up in the sand, dazed and disoriented. The submarine was gone. What happened, Professor?" Basil's head ached. There was no answer. "Professor?" Basil asked again. He tried to clear the ringing from his ears, but the professor was still lying down, his face in the sand. He wasn't moving. "Professor!" Louise shrieked. She rushed to his side. It took all their strength to roll the large man over, but Basil and Louise did it. Louise began to cry. "He's dead, isn't he?" She put her head to the professor's chest and sobbed. "He was saving us," she began, but then she stopped. "His heart is beating. He's alive." The professor coughed, and as he slowly regained his senses, Rathbone and the caretaker came running, followed by a pack of monkeys. "Quickly," Rathbone said, "get him back inside." The monkeys helped the professor up to the safety of the engine room. Basil turned and looked back. What had caused that explosion? From the volcano entrance, he could see past the lagoon. I'm trying to get a good angle here. It's not going well today. He could see past the lagoon and out to sea. Once again, the sunlight reflected off something in the distant ocean, but this time Basil recognized it. It was the boat he had sailed back to Maine, Von Rottweil's boat. By now, a dozen shiny pronged baubles bobbed in the water. Soon there were many more, floating like a school of round, puffed-up blowfish. Metallic blowfish. "Professor!" Basil screamed. "I know what they are. They're bombs, and they're drifting toward the island." Everyone gathered and stood in stunned silence. The island's engines were still shut down. They wouldn't be repaired for hours. Out on the ship, watching its fiendish handiwork, the malevolent doctor stood erect with an air of boastful victory. His voice was surprisingly loud. "I gave the island life," he proclaimed, "and now I will take it away to the bottom of the sea." The bombs were drifting closer now. When they strike the island, Basil thought, the bombs will start a chain reaction of explosions, creating a hole that will sink us all. Louise turned to the professor. "What do we do now?" But the professor didn't have an answer. His mind was still too groggy from the explosion in the lagoon. He looked at her sadly. "Perhaps a song, Louise? On your flute, my dear? Make it a good one. Your best." He turned to the caretaker. "And what do you think, Arthur?" Louise's soft melody began to wind around them. It sounded familiar to Basil, and he began to hum along. Soon all the children were humming. All of them were humming. The caretaker stroked his chin and squinted down at the bombs with anger and disdain. "We mustn't let rage cloud our judgment, and this is no time to give up." Slowly a smile spread across his face. They could all see that an idea had formed, like a sudden move in a chess game that no one could have foreseen. "Well," the caretaker said lightly, "since Von Rottweil is determined to sink Monkey Island, maybe we should meet him halfway." Everyone stared at him. Then a grin appeared under the professor's bushy mustache. "Ah," the professor said with a knowing look. "I see what you're up to, Arthur. But do you think this barge can withstand the pressure?" "We'll find out." The caretaker rushed off to the engine room. "We don't have much of a choice, do we?" "Well, what do you want us to do?" For once Louise was baffled. "Just come inside and brace yourself." By now, the caretaker was racing up the scaffolding to a station behind a locked gate. From a massive ring of keys, the caretaker pulled out a tiny brass one and opened the lock at the bottom of the stairs. He quickly flipped a row of switches. Then he grabbed a thick rope and called out to everyone below, "This is it! Hold on!" There he goes. Wonder what he's doing. With that, he yanked the rope down. Crack! Wham! A thunderous whooshing sound followed, like a massive wave hitting the shore. The entire island slanted downward, sending everything sliding across the floor and crashing into the wall. "What's going on?" Basil cried. "He's brilliant," Louise explained. "The caretaker opened up all the intake gates on the side of the island, facing Von Rottweil and the bombs. When all that water blows out, it's going to create a mountainous wave, pushing the bombs away from the island and right back to Von Rottweil's ship." Now it was Von Rottweil who stood frozen in silence, watching as his own bombs were turned against him. Explosions began to rock the sea safely away from the island. Von Rottweil tried to steer out of harm's way, but the bombs kept coming. Back on the island, the caretaker quickly raised the rope and then pulled another. This released the ballast water on the other side of the island, creating a new wave that pushed the bombs even faster at Von Rottweil. The monkeys cheered as they watched the doctor panic. "Good riddance," Rathbone screeched in anger. Uh-oh. The caretaker gently placed his hand on Rathbone's shoulder. "I understand, old friend, but that's not our way now, is it? If you take on the hatred of your defeated enemy, then what have you won?" Rathbone looked up at the caretaker, his eyes filled with tears. "You're right. We need to seek justice, not vengeance, if we're going to truly be free. And we need to show compassion," the caretaker said, "even to those we loathe for good reasons." But what can be done? Rathbone turned to watch Von Rottweil. "He sealed his own fate. We're as helpless to save him as he is to save himself." "Not quite." Louise had that determined look on her face Basil knew all too well. "Come on, let's go." She grabbed Basil's hand. Together they ran up the stairs, heading to the top of the volcano. Meanwhile, Von Rottweil was frantic. The bombs were ripping through the hull and his ship was sinking. His only hope for escape, the little rowboat tied to the stern, and it was already underwater. The 3 last bombs were closing in. Von Rottweil leaped off the back of the ship to seek safety in the water. At that moment, all 3 bombs struck. Stunned and struggling to stay afloat, Von Rottweil rolled on his back, gasping for air. He lunged at a beam from the hull and reached it before he sank. The nearest land was the island. He had no choice but to kick his way to shore before the frigid waters killed him. And then he saw a sight that made him kick even harder. A fin. The tall black fin hovered on the surface. Then it was joined by a second fin. As the sharks closed in, the doctor stopped kicking. Only a miracle could save him now, and he did not believe in miracles. He closed his eyes and waited for the end. That's when he heard an unexpected cry, a loud, ear-piercing screech. Wham! Something slammed into his back. Terrified, he shut his eyes even tighter. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Instead of bone-crunching jaws, he felt a chilly breeze. Was this the afterlife? When Von Rottweil opened his eyes, the ocean was far below. He was sailing through the air, and sharp talons clutched his coat. Beatrice had plucked him out of the water as if he were a big fish. It's a pretty big fish. Looking down at him were Louise and Basil, giggling as they took the defiant doctor back to the island. He kicked and wailed the whole way. Chapter 11, A New World. The New World. Upon his return to Monkey Island, Von Rottweil was locked up in a cell until he could be transported back to Helios to stand trial. "All right, young lady," the professor said kindly. "Now that Beatrice is back in good health, it's time for you to take Basil home. Then you fly directly to Helios. Understand?" "Yes, sir," she replied with a sheepish grin. "Good," the professor continued. "And when you get back to Helios, you tell your mother and the rest of the High Council to arrange transport for us along with a special security force for Von Rottweil. I'll be happy to tell her that although you broke the rules, again. You've clearly been practicing her unification equations on your flute. Good girl. Now, say your goodbyes and run along before it gets dark. Thanks, Professor. I think I've got the dark energy part figured out. Can we talk about it when I get home? Louise, it would be my pleasure. Maybe you'll share some of your ideas with Basil one of these days. He'll be understanding more and more of it, you know. Well, that's what my mother told me. He's got a natural countercurrent. That must be what happened here on the island, right? The professor's eyes twinkled. It's time for you to head on home, my dear. Stop procrastinating. Basil was sad to leave. Great Uncle Arthur and his new friends, but he was glad that the monkeys were on their way to becoming self-sufficient. He hugged the caretaker and Rathbone one more time. I hope to see you soon, Great Uncle Arthur, he said in a trembling voice. I love my mother, but living in a lighthouse in Maine is awfully ordinary. I'll be in touch, I promise. And you're growing like a weed, laddie boy, the professor added in his booming baritone. No doubt you'll be one of us soon, or perhaps you already are. Louise mounted Beatrice and extended her hand to Basil. As they took flight, they could hear the sound of engines beginning to churn, and the smoke appeared from the volcano. The island was once again in motion, safely avoiding detection from the outside world. It'll be interesting to come back in a few months to see how they make out, don't you think? Louise asked. Basil nodded in agreement. The island moved quite a distance since we first arrived, she said nonchalantly, so we're taking a different course back to your lighthouse. Really? So why are you telling me that? Well, Louise said in a playful manner that always seemed to lead to adventure. Have you ever seen the six-legged rock toad of the Massivodius Desert? It's on the way. No, Basil said with a smile, but it sounds extraordinary. So they're going on another adventure, even though they were told to go straight home to the Massivodius Desert. Bum, bum, bum. So that is the end of our Basil book. I don't think they actually ever, that Wiley Miller actually ever wrote a third book. So that is where we will leave it. And maybe someday he will. So we'll have to keep an eye out for it. I hope you enjoyed our Basil series. It was fun reading it to you. And our next series begins tomorrow. And it will be called The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. See you guys later. Have a good day. Bye.